There are moments inside the walls of Windsor Castle that the public never hears about. Moments that reshape the quiet internal order of the British monarchy in ways that no official press release will ever confirm. What has reportedly unfolded in recent days is exactly that kind of moment. And according to sources familiar with the inner workings of the royal household, it may represent the most significant shift in palace power dynamics since the death of Princess Diana nearly 3 decades ago. To understand the full weight of what has happened, you have to go back. Not just to the 1990s, not just to the year Diana died, but all the way back to the very beginning of a wound that has been sitting open inside this family for longer than most people realize. Because what William has reportedly done, with the quiet, deliberate backing of Princess Anne, was not an impulsive act of grief. It was the final move in a game that has been running for 25 years. Princess Diana died on the 31st of August, 1997, in a tunnel in Paris. She was 36 years old. Within hours of her death being confirmed, the world came to a standstill. People laid flowers outside Kensington Palace in numbers that stretched further than anyone could count. They wept openly in the streets of London, in cities across America, in villages across Africa and Asia and Australia. She had touched something in people that went beyond celebrity, beyond royalty, beyond anything the institution she had married into had ever inspired. She was genuinely, deeply, universally loved. Inside the palace, the mood was different. It was controlled. It was cold. And it moved with a kind of efficiency that many royal observers have since described as deeply troubling. Among the early concerns raised in those first hours, according to accounts from people with knowledge of palace communications at the time, was the question of royal jewelry that Diana may have had in her possession in Paris. The institution was already thinking about reclamation, already thinking about legacy management, already thinking about control. And Camilla Parker Bowles, the woman Diana herself had privately described as the third person in her marriage, was already repositioning. What Camilla did in the months and years following Diana's death has been documented in various forms by royal biographers, palace insiders, and staff members who were present during those years. She did not simply move into the spaces Diana had occupied. She methodically erased the evidence that Diana had ever been there at all. Fresh flowers that Diana had personally selected and arranged throughout the palace rooms she lived in were removed and, by multiple accounts, burned rather than simply replaced. Not thrown away. Burned. The bedroom Diana had used, the room where she had held her sons and written in her diary and spent her most private hours, was ordered locked. Camilla did not want to use it. But she also made certain that nobody else ever would. It was sealed away as though it contained something shameful. Diana's personal belongings were boxed and relocated. Her photographs began disappearing from prominent positions in ceremonial spaces. And in the Hall of Matriarchs at Windsor Castle, one of the most significant spaces in the entire royal residence, a wall that has historically honored the most consequential women in the history of the British crown, Diana's portrait never appeared. It had been commissioned during one of the most luminous periods of her public life, during years when she was at the absolute peak of her presence and her power as a public figure. The portrait was always intended for that wall. And then she died, and the portrait was quietly removed from consideration, wrapped in protective material, and placed in palace storage, where it sat for over 20 years. That is not a bureaucratic oversight. That is a choice made by people with authority over those spaces. And it was a choice that 2 people inside the royal family never once stopped being angry about. William Arthur Philip Lewis was 15 years old when he walked behind his mother's coffin through the streets of London on the 6th of September, 1997. He walked in public, in front of hundreds of millions of people watching around the world, with his face completely still. He was a child. He was a child who had already been told by his own mother that his father had been conducting a long-term affair with another woman. Diana had sat her eldest son down and explained it to him herself, in terms he was old enough to understand. She told him there were 3 people in their marriage. She told him that was why everything had broken apart. Harry found out differently, from a television program, with no warning and no preparation. He turned to his mother and asked who the woman on screen was. Diana had to explain it to her youngest child in that moment, on the spot, with no time to find the right words. But the piece of knowledge that would come to define William's anger most completely did not arrive until later. In 1995, 2 years before her death, Diana wrote a private note to her solicitor, Lord Mishkin. In that letter, she stated that she believed Charles was planning to arrange her death in a staged car accident, brake failure, she wrote, or serious head injury, so that he could be free to move forward with his life. She wrote that her husband was planning an accident involving her car. She wrote that Camilla was being used as a distraction, a decoy, while the real machinery of her destruction was being assembled around her. 2 years after she wrote those words, Diana died in a car crash in a tunnel in Paris. The note was handed to police after her death, but reportedly sat untouched for 6 years before it finally reached Scotland Yard. Charles was eventually questioned about its contents, privately, at St. James's Palace. When William came to understand the full contents of that letter, when he grasped not only what his mother had feared, but what had subsequently been done to her memory inside the very walls where he had grown up, something inside him changed permanently. He watched Camilla take up residence in the spaces his mother had lived in. He watched the erasure happen around him. He watched the Hall of Matriarchs stand empty where Diana's portrait should have hung. And he made a decision. He was going to be patient. He was going to learn how the institution worked from the inside. And when the time finally came, he was going to use every rule, every protocol, every historical precedent the palace had ever established, and he was going to bring his mother home. Princess Anne's connection to all of this runs deeper than most people appreciate, and it predates Diana entirely. Before Camilla married Andrew Parker Bowles in 1973, Andrew Parker Bowles had been in a serious romantic relationship with and herself. By multiple accounts, marriage had been a genuine possibility. The relationship was ended because Andrew was Catholic, and Anne, as a senior member of the Church of England, was constitutionally barred from marrying him. She stepped aside. She had no real choice in the matter. And within a very short period of time, Camilla moved in and Andrew proposed to her instead, and sat in the church at their wedding. She watched it happen. And the woman who had taken the man and had loved then spent the next several decades conducting a covert affair with Anne's brother, systematically dismantling Anne's sister-in-law's marriage, and eventually walking into Buckingham Palace during a coronation ceremony wearing a crown. Royal author Penny Junor has written that Camilla was deeply intimidated by and for years, that Anne's cold and unflinching manner toward her was a source of genuine anxiety, that the unresolved history between them created a tension that never dissipated and never could. After the 2023 coronation, reports emerged that Anne confronted Camilla directly at a private function and told her plainly, "You are not the queen. You are the king's wife," and has reportedly never bowed to Camilla. She is said to have personally requested an exemption from that protocol from Queen Elizabeth herself, and to have been granted it. For 25 years, and watched Diana's portrait stay off the wall. She watched the Hall of Matriarchs remain incomplete. And she waited, in the way that only people with very long memories and very deep patience can wait. What William reportedly did in the days preceding this moment was meticulous in a way that speaks to just how long he had been preparing for it. He did not simply decide one morning to hang his mother's portrait and dare the institution to object. He spent years working through the proper channels, studying portrait placement protocol, reviewing the historical records of how each previous portrait had been installed in the Hall of Matriarchs, consulting with curators and royal archivists, ensuring that every single institutional rule had been followed with absolute precision. The entire operation was constructed so carefully that once it was complete, no one inside the palace would have legitimate grounds to challenge it or reverse it. He had been building toward this for the better part of 2 decades. He wanted it to be permanent. He wanted it to be unassailable. The night before it happened, William called Anne. The conversation, by all accounts, was short. Both of them already knew everything that needed to be said. They had been carrying the same wound in their different ways for the same length of time, and reportedly said that Diana deserved to come home, and that it was long overdue. William told her it was happening the next day. The call ended. Neither of them needed to say anything more. Camilla had been deliberately scheduled for a public engagement outside London that day. It was not accidental. It was a calculated move to ensure she was out of Windsor Castle while the restoration was carried out and to guarantee that by the time she returned, the portrait would already be in place, officially installed, institutionally confirmed, and completely irreversible. While she was away, the Hall of Matriarchs was closed to all but a small number of personally vetted staff members. Nothing appeared on the official royal calendar. No press office was involved. No announcement was prepared. This was conducted entirely in silence and entirely on purpose. The protective wrapping was removed from Diana's portrait in that gallery for the first time in over 2 decades. Staff members who were present in the room that evening described moving with the portrait the way you move with something that has been treated badly and deserves to be handled with extraordinary care. Princess and was there in person. She had insisted on overseeing the placement herself. This was not a task she was willing to delegate. She had waited too long and carried too much to let someone else stand in that room at that moment on her behalf. The frame was positioned. The measurements were confirmed. And within 90 minutes of the portrait arriving in the gallery, Diana's face was on the wall of the Hall of Matriarchs at Windsor Castle. She was placed directly beside the late Queen Elizabeth II. 2 women side by side, one who had reigned for 70 years, and one who never had the chance to reign at all, but who had defined the emotional heart of the modern monarchy in ways that no coronation ceremony could manufacture or replicate. When it was done, the room went quiet. No one spoke for a long moment. Everyone simply stood there and looked. And then Princess Anne, who had walked into that room carrying 50 years of personal grief and fury and deeply complicated history, said something quietly, almost to herself. Staff members standing nearby heard it clearly. She said that Diana belonged there. She said she always did. Camilla returned to Windsor the following morning expecting an ordinary day. She was told what had happened, and by every account available, her reaction was immediate, physical, and completely uncontrolled. She went rigid. She demanded the portrait be removed at once. She called for an emergency meeting with William. She insisted that Charles intervene on her behalf. She demanded a full accounting from every member of staff who had participated in the restoration. Every single demand was refused. For the first time in her decades inside the royal family, Camilla found herself with no authority to reverse a decision that had been made around her and without her. She turned to her husband. Charles had spent years fighting for a place inside the institution, battling public opinion, battling the press, battling his own sons to make room for this woman beside him. He had been the one constant in her corner throughout all of it. She stood in front of him and waited for him to act. He said nothing. He let the portrait stay. He let his son's decision stand entirely unchallenged. He did not make a single call. He did not raise a single objection. He sat in silence and allowed what his son had done to remain permanent. Palace insiders described that moment of Charles's silence as the most devastating thing Camilla had experienced in her entire time inside the royal family. Not because he failed to defend her, but because of what his failure to defend her revealed. That Charles had made his final reckoning with what had been done to Diana. That he had chosen, at last, to stop fighting against the tide of history and let his first wife's memory be restored to the place it had always belonged. Then Princess Anne walked into the room. Face to face, she looked at Camilla and said 5 words. "It is what Diana deserved." Camilla stood in silence and received those words from the one woman inside that family who had never bowed to her, never softened toward her, and never once pretended that their shared history was anything other than what it was. What followed in the days after the restoration was not symbolic. It was structural. Camilla was quietly removed from a series of upcoming public engagements. Royal patronages that Diana had personally built and poured herself into were reactivated and moved under the operational umbrella of Catherine, Princess of Wales. Charitable organizations that Diana had championed throughout the 1990s were brought back into formal prominence in William's official schedule. The royal family's communications began referencing Diana's name with a frequency and depth of institutional respect that had been entirely absent for years. Within the first 2 weeks following the restoration, Diana's name appeared in official palace communications more times than it had in the preceding 2 years combined. This is not grief. This is governance. This is a future king making clear, through the language that institutions actually speak, through scheduling and patronage and official acknowledgement, that the balance of power has shifted and is not going to shift back. William was 15 years old when he walked behind his mother's coffin. He made a promise to himself in that silence, in front of the entire watching world, with his face completely still. He waited. He learned how the institution worked. He built the legal and procedural foundation so carefully and so thoroughly that when the moment came, it could not be undone. He brought Anne in because she was the one person in the family who had both the institutional standing and the personal history to make the restoration permanent. Diana's portrait now hangs in the Hall of Matriarchs at Windsor Castle. It hangs beside Queen Elizabeth. It hangs where it was always supposed to hang, in the most sacred ceremonial space in the royal residence, among the most important women in the history of the British crown. It is on that wall because a son kept a promise he made to himself at 15 years old and spent the next 25 years quietly, methodically, and absolutely making sure he was in a position to keep it. Diana is home. And for Camilla, who spent 25 years believing she had won, the realization that she had not, that she had never been winning at all, only waiting, arrived on what may well prove to be the worst morning of her decades inside the institution she worked so hard to reshape. The Hall of Matriarchs is complete. And the boy who walked in silence through the streets of London has finally, after all this time, brought his mother to the wall where she always belonged.